Hi everyone, and in today's video we're going to take a look at this fantastically rare Balvenie 1937 50-year-old. First things first, so we need to take this box off the cask here. It's a bit nerve-wracking having a £45,000 bottle of whiskey on the table next to you, and this, as far as I'm aware, is the only bottle of Balvenie 1937 50-year-old available for sale worldwide at the moment. We've got it up for sale at the moment for a customer for £45,000. So if you've got a bit of spare change and you fancy a nice bottle for Christmas, then this one might not be the one for you. But if you do want a knockout bottle for your collection, then I don't think you're going to get a better bottle than this. So the Balvenie distillery itself was set up in 1892/1893, and it was set up by William Grant and Sons. It shares a site with the Kinninvie distillery and also the Glenfiddich distillery, and it also used to neighbour a ruined castle, which the Balvenie distillery was once named after, Glen Gordon. Now, by the time the distillery was set up, this ruined castle had been replaced by another castle, which itself had been subsequently ruined and was then built into the Balvenie complex and was used for their maltings. Now, another thing that I find quite interesting about Balvenie is that it was one of the first distilleries to use a second finishing period for the whiskies that it released. So the Balvenie Double Wood that was released in 1993 was actually the whiskey spent the majority of its life maturing in bourbon casks and bourbon barrels, and then was finished in sherry casks. And whilst it's finished for a short period of time in those sherry casks. And we take for granted again that these sort of finishing periods, which is pretty much on most releases from indie bottlers and everything nowadays, is quite common. But when Balvenie released that Double Wood series in 1993, it was one of the first ever to do that. Now, another thing that we take for granted in 2020 with the obvious release of the Macallan Red Collection and the Glenrothes 50-year-old is that high age statement bottlings are quite common, when in actual fact they're incredibly scarce. Now, the Red Collection features a 40, 50, 71, 74 and 78-year-old bottlings, and Balvenie themselves, they've released I think 6 50-year-old bottlings now, the most recent being in 2018 I understand, and that was retailed at £27,500. So it puts this one, which is several decades earlier, at £45,000 into perspective. Now, why are high age statement bottlings uncommon? Well, it comes down to chemistry. Whiskey itself is made of two compounds. You've got the water and you've got the alcohol. So if you've got a bottle at say 58% ABV, it means 58% of that liquid is alcohol and the remaining 42% is water. Now, casks are filled from the distilleries normally at around 63.5% ABV. Comes off the stills some higher than that, around 70% ABV, but it's often sort of watered down to 63.5% ABV to sort of keep the maturation period relatively short. Now, the Scotch Whisky Association dictate that whiskey has to be bottled over 40% ABV in order for it to be called single malt Scotch whisky, and that's important for two reasons. One, you can't just put a cask of whiskey down in Scotland and let it mature indefinitely, because that ABV is going to come down and down and down every year by around 0.5%. Now, in America, that ABV increases every year, but in Scotland, because of the warehouse conditions, the ABV actually drops every year. So if you put a cask of whiskey down today, it's very unlikely that it's going to make it to sort of 40, 50, 60 years old, because as soon as that ABV hits below 40%, it's no longer legally whiskey. And the yield, you've got the evaporation of the alcohol, but you've then also got the evaporation of the water or the compound of the whiskey, losing every year to the angels, and that goes down by around 2% a year. So the whiskey that went into these bottlings, there were 360 produced, actually came from 4 casks. So it took 4 casks being vatted together to get the outrun for 360 bottles here. Now, Macallan are the king of high age statements, obviously with the Red Collection, but they've also done a number of high profile 50-year-old bottlings. They did a 50-year-old in 2018, they also did the Millennium Decanter, the 1955 Fine and Rare, and I think they also did, what was the other one that they did? It was the 50-year-old in the Leak, obviously. So But the one that really started it all for Macallan, the 50-year-olds for Macallan, was the anniversary malt bottling. Now, this is a bit controversial for a number of reasons. That Macallan anniversary malt, it was bottled or distilled in 1928 and bottled in 1983. Those that are quick at maths will see that that's a 55-year-old bottle, not a 50-year-old. But it was actually labelled as a 50-year-old on the bottle, but said vintage 1928, bottled 1983. So we don't know why they did that. It was also bottled at 38.6% ABV. Now, as we've just mentioned, by today's laws, Macallan couldn't release that bottle and call it whiskey because it's lower than 40% ABV. And this is where the Milroys of Soho, who commissioned this bottling from William Grant and Sons, really sort of grabbed hold of, because although they knew that that 50-year-old bottling had been released by Macallan in the early 1980s, when this was released and made for sale in 1988, they marketed it as the second higher, they noted that it was the only bottle or the highest proof bottle of any 50-year-old bottling that had ever been released. And that high ABV, echoed by their statements there, at 42%, we wouldn't necessarily call that high ABV by today's standard, but for a 50-year-old bottling, that's a very high ABV. So the bottle itself was distilled in 1937, 2 years before the start of World War II, and in the same year that Edward VIII married Wallace Simpson. So it's a fabulous bottle, and it was actually commissioned, as I've already mentioned, by Milroys of Soho. So Milroys of Soho, they were one of the first very serious whisky bars in London. They were set up in 1964 by John Milroy and his brother Wallace Milroy. Wallace was more the financier. I believe he was a gold miner in South Africa for a number of years. And in the 1960s, we've got to remember that the first single malt was only marketed to England in 1963, and that was Glenfiddich as well, so another William Grant and Sons distillery. So the Milroys of Soho, they set up their shop in London, and it was originally called the Milroys Soho Wine Market, but they soon increased their range of malts from 3, I think it was in 1964, to several hundred in the 1970s, and they were actually one of the most sought after and well-stocked whisky bars and shops in the whole world. The Prime Minister would shop there, and they grew great acclaim. And obviously they had the power to bottle and commission this bottling from William Grant and Sons. And we don't have to speculate about how this bottle came into existence, because there's a fantastic quote from John Milroy in Emmanuel Dron's fantastic book. I'll just grab the back book for you now here. If you've not got a copy of this book, you really need to get a copy of it if you're serious about collecting whisky. And there's a whole double spread there about this 1937. But it's worth quoting what John Milroy said. Peter Grant Gordon invited us to Glenfiddich and Balvenie distilleries, where we noticed 4 casks of Balvenie 50-year-old gathering dust in a corner of a warehouse. After a few drams, Peter agreed to bottle these and sell most of it to us exclusively for £150 per bottle, which we offered to our Japanese customers for £360 a bottle, and pre-sold most of it very quickly. And this resulted in Wallace and I being invited to spend 1 month in Japan promoting this at £1,000 a bottle with 7 importers group. So they bought this at £150 a bottle and then sold it for £360 a bottle and then £1,000 a bottle. So I think what's happening here is they bought it from William Grant and Sons at £150 a bottle. They sold probably most of it wholesale at £360 a bottle, and then it was being retailed at £1,000 a bottle in Japan. That's just my understanding. If someone wants to correct me of it, that's how I've interpreted their sort of quote there. Happily receive any corrections in the comments. So now we know a bit about the bottle and the history of the bottle, let's take a look at the physical bottle itself. So any of you looking at this in 2020 will obviously see that it doesn't look like a modern bottling, or it doesn't look like any bottlings that were around in the 1980s at the time, and that's for good reason. This was bottled to replicate the style of bottles that were common at the turn of the century, so from the 1900s to the 1930s, and it's actually a direct copy. The label is a direct copy here of the Glenfiddich that was released in around 1903, 1908, and then this red slip label at the bottom is also a direct replica of that. So it's not trying to look like a new bottle in the 1980s, it's trying to replicate the history and the age of bottles that were produced at the turn of the century. And that again is to emphasize the age and the vintage of these bottles. Now, on the back of these bottles would have originally been, in the turn of the century, 1900, 1930s, a diamond label on the back that stated its medicinal qualities. And this wasn't according to Balvenie or Glenfiddich or Grant and Sons, it was by the Lancet. The Lancet medical journey claimed that whiskey, especially that from Balvenie and Glenfiddich, was medicinal. Now, clearly by the 1980s, these things had to change. Now, this bottle comes with its original wooden box here. Now, for those of you who know a little bit about whiskey, you will recognise this being similar to the Macallan anniversary malt bottlings and boxes, beg your pardon. It's being a cheap pine box, stencilled on the front to look a little bit like a front of a cask or a cask head. And unlike the Macallan ones, it's hinged. So it hinges open and it's stencilled on the inside too. And inside this, you've got the original information sleeve here, which talks a bit about the distillery. It shows you a bit about the ruined castle there. It was incorporated into incorporated into the distillery for its maltings. Easy for me to say. And there's another quote of Wallace Milroy on the back, which I think is worth quoting as well. So he goes on to say, "To the best of my knowledge, no other 50-year-old pure malt whisky has been bottled at such a high natural cask strength. This has contributed to make the Balvenie 50-year-old pure malt whisky such a rare phenomenon. For a whisky so old, it has retained a remarkable degree of body whilst achieving a sweetness and richness of taste that only whiskies of this age can impart. Incomparable and singular quality." So, let's get on to the tasting. I wish I could. I really wish I could, but I don't have £45,000 to spend on this bottle. But if you do, we've got it available at marklittler.com. And it's obviously included is the original wooden box and this slip label. It's being sold by one of our customers. We're brokering the sale of this bottle, and it's a fantastic bottle just to have in terms of its history and sort of what it represents and what the political climate was like when this whiskey was distilled. It's fascinating to think. So here it is. It's the Balvenie 50-year-old, distilled 1937 and bottled in 1987.